So as people start to jump in, we have been spending the last few weeks talking a lot about safety, how that intersects with policy, and how people can reopen buildings and businesses um, while protecting employees and visitors and so forth. And a lot of people who tend to join these types of talks are from the occupier space or from real estate and are trying to figure out their own policies so that they can keep their employees safe. So before we get into some of the specific questions, would you mind, you spend a lot of time in DC. I know you're not there at the moment, but you spend a lot of time in DC. What's kind of the perspective your day job gives you on what's happening in the world right now?
So folks wonder, what does a lobbyist do? And what I do for a living is I solve political problems and I create political problems.
What does that last part mean?
That means I love a David versus Goliath fight where you're representing a small startup that has the right solution, is innovating, but there is some mammoth large company that knows everyone and is trying to hold on to market share, and then going and creating problems for that incumbent so that the smaller guy can compete.
Gotcha. And so you work with, I mean, certainly in Silicon Valley, we would consider them large companies, but some of the largest startups in the world. Is that right?
We're very fortunate to represent companies like SpaceX and Uber and Apple. We're equally as fortunate to represent smaller companies that might be Series A, Series B, looking to sell into the federal government or looking to change the policy debate and position themselves as thought leaders, but also represent brands that we've all grown up with, like PepsiCo and Marriott.
Hmm.
Um,
Have you ever seen anything like this happen before? I mean, you've been in DC a long time. I imagine government is having to adjust in ways that it never would have expected.
so you go through cycles of crisis. You go through cycles of elections. You have a 9/11. You have 2008. But nobody has ever seen or experienced anything quite like this, where the government is continuing to move forward, but in a very different way. And none of us have ever seen a situation where 39 million people have applied for unemployment.
Hmm.
And people are looking for solutions and they're looking to DC to help. And when Congress engaged in earnest on this issue in March, there was this great rush into the city virtually to sort of say, all right, you guys are giving out bags of money. Where is my bag of money?
Sure. And you're talking about PPP or more broadly
Just
the CARES
generally.
program?
Just generally, there was sort of a rush into the city, and this was before certain programs had been set to sort of say, hey, we need help. And so we've gone through three major bills that have focused on stabilizing, but not on stimulus. And in the days, weeks, months to come, we're going to start seeing specific packages focused on different parts of the economy.
Sure. How has working in the federal government changed? I mean, is everyone on Zoom? Are they on AIM? Like, what's the preferred method of communication, and is work still getting done?
So work is still getting done. It has been a transition. The federal government is not known for being a laptop culture.
Sure.
And so, one of the things we saw early on was that procurement folks at DoD did not have access to laptops because they were not senior enough, which slows down a big part of government. So, the first couple of weeks, sort of getting everyone online was a challenge. In terms of being able to connect with decision makers, having long-standing relationships in this environment is really helpful.
Sure, of course.
Because you've got people's cell phone numbers. But in terms of how meetings are happening, people are still going into government buildings. Physical meetings are really limited, but for some it's Zoom calls. But for the White House and for others concerned about security concerns, it gets a little challenging, the sort of hoops you have to go through.
I was talking to someone, he is responsible for buildings in 60 countries, 87,000 employees, 150-year-old business. And he said, if you sort of like, for a second, if you set aside the devastation that's occurring, one of the strange outcomes of COVID-19 is it's having this profound, it's like one of the fastest change agents he's ever experienced in his career. And I'm curious, like, you say laptops to people who weren't senior enough. Is the government modernizing faster than it ever would have before? Are we going to see some of these things stick? Or are we going to go back to usual once this blows over?
So I think clearly we're on a path of acceleration as it relates to use of technology. Government never moves quickly. And so the agencies themselves are trying to figure out how to operate in this new world. I think, the IRS still relies on faxing of documents. And it will become a question of, sure, we'd like to modernize, but we need money and people and technology partners to do that. And then you see the sort of time lag. But I think, as Congress is beginning its annual appropriations process,
Mm-hmm.
we'll see money going out to the agencies to accelerate the growth that we're seeing now. But the one thing you can always count on is that Washington is 4 to 6 years behind everybody else.
Did you say 46 or 4
No,
to 6?
I said 4 to 6. Some would agree with your 46 years. Not 47.
Yeah, I apologize. There might be some background noise, and I might have to relocate. Okay. So the Senate wants to reopen the economy. Many people want to reopen the economy, but the Senate majority wants to reopen the economy. Sorry. Is there a circumstance in which the Senate goes back to work physically, but the House doesn't? And then I'm going to go off video and change locations.
Okay. So the Senate is back at work this week, and the Senate is just like every business in that they're trying to figure out, how do you work in this new world where there are no clear guidelines and it's a bit of a free-for-all, and everybody has their own opinions about how to do things. So reports from folks who have been on the Senate side of the Capitol, certain senators are refusing to wear masks. Other senators are only wearing masks, don't want to see their staff. Other senators are insisting that their staff come into the offices. The Senate is still voting in person, and so their Senate leadership is very focused on projecting we're here at work. House Democrats came in last week and passed a big piece of legislation, but they also passed a bill that allows them to vote remotely and to operate remotely. And that's the first time we've ever seen a Chamber of the Commerce go into a mode like this.
Sure. There's one of the things someone pointed out to me, that there was this very interesting circumstance in which, just because legislators want to go back to work or want to keep a building open, they're not the only ones who go back to work. There's all this support staff that has to come back to work as well. And there's an interesting corollary in the private sector where, just because you have certain team members or executives who want to come back, there's a whole support structure, cleaning and facilities and operations and so forth, that has to come back as well.
Yeah, the cleaning piece is a really important piece. The security piece, apparently the rodents have gone wild in the house
Rodents.
office buildings, that absent regular tenants, they are roaming the halls.
Fascinating.
Yes.
It's like the coyotes in San Francisco. They're all like walking down, Mission Street or Valencia. You did say rodents, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And you also have to understand that on the House side of the Capitol, we have members of Congress who regularly sleep in their offices because they cannot afford having a home and family in the district and, an apartment in DC. And so, going forward, I don't know how you socially distance when your boss is sleeping in the office and you're required to go in.
Yeah, it's funny and it's also not funny, like at the same time. I guess. All right, so we've seen, changing topics, we've seen guidelines start to come out around reopening the economy. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, certain criteria that you have to hit around 14 days of declining cases or caseload, ICU bed expectations, testing. Do you think that there are going to be federal guidelines or state recommendations around reopening office buildings?
I think folks are very hungry for guidance. We have an administration that wants to push this decision making and guidance down to the state level. This issue is coming to a head as Congress is struggling with how do we give liability protection to companies for their employees, for their customers. And when you start to ask the questions of liability, the first question that comes up is, all right, what is the standard? If you meet the standard, then you should be protected from liability. Absent a standard, it's hard to have liability protection. And so this is an item where Democrats and Republicans are having discussions. The White House has been reluctant to have any of the agencies put forward really clear, tough, with teeth rules, not wanting to artificially limit the return to economic growth. And so it's really, we're in this wild, wild west environment where each individual company, building owner has to ask the question, what is in the best interest of my employees, what is in the best interest of our clients, and what is considered best in class, and how do I get there?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess what you're saying is, from like, if I'm in real estate or if I'm an occupier, I'm a business, I should expect the federal government to, at the very least, have a very specific recommendation, if not legislation around liability. whether it's limitations on liability or it's employee protections or it's like some type of OSHA standard, that we should expect something to come out?
Yeah, I think we will see something come out. This has been an issue where it has been Senator McConnell's #1 priority going forward. Speaker Pelosi has said, I have no red lines, but in the last bill that passed the House, the HEROES Act, they specifically call out the need for OSHA to be setting standards.
Gotcha. This brings up another really interesting question. Well, not trying to be self-congratulatory, but something that I've heard from other people is, should companies compete with the state procurement, federal procurement for PPE, for testing, for specialized types of support around medical? How much should a business think of itself as its own independent sovereign? And how much of it should it think of itself as waiting for state support or for federal support when it comes to protecting employees?
So this is a really interesting question that I think each of us is struggling with in our own way. And the lack of clear leadership has led to this situation where you have the federal and the state governments competing against each other, as well as corporations. And we do have a mechanism in terms of the Defense Production Act where the White House could be taking sort of more control over the situation and coming up with an allocation plan, but has instead sort of said, we're going to leave this to the states. And so I think in this sort of uncertain time period where you have multiple people trying to lead, it's up to each individual CEO to lead in their way. And I think it's a very rational response to figure out, all right, how do I get PPE for my people? How do I create a supply chain that is COVID-19 resistant? How do I make sure that I can take care of my customers?
And so these are things that you think are a perfectly reasonable approach, that organizations ought to be out to support themselves as they see fit.
Yeah, absent guidance otherwise, I think in this environment, waiting is the wrong solution. That waiting for clear answers, that one has to just go forward in earnestness in terms of seeing where the market's going, but not expect there not going to be any bright lines.
Mm-hmm.
No one is going to give you permission for the lawyers, the general counsels of companies. Like, this is the hardest time period to give guidance because we are in this fog of war. And how do you protect your company, protect your building when everything is subject to change? And those in power continue to tweak the rules. I mean,
Yeah.
One of the issues that's gotten a lot of attention is the loan program, the PPP program. And it was put together really quickly. And a lot of money has gone out the door. But what's really hard for small companies is the rules of the program keep changing. And every day a different clarifying question will be answered. And we've had a safe harbor where people can return the money and then at the end of the safe harbor, there's an extension, and we're going to see a bill in the House next week that makes much needed changes to the program. So this is one of the linchpin programs to help small businesses, and it's continuing to morph, and banks as well as small businesses trying to use the program can't really keep up, and it creates more uncertainty. So you have to do the best based on the facts that you have today in terms of your decision making.
Tell me about competition. You have some interesting perspectives on what used to be competing for with the best product is now being some form of anointment. Can you explain what that was?
So one of the interesting things that has happened is that Washington has become the center of the world, that it is no longer market by market, who has the best product, who has the best service, compete and you win. When the federal government has, pumped out trillions of dollars into the economy, they are in effect picking who the market favors and disfavors. And so anyone not actively involved in what is happening in Washington, D.C. is giving up market share. Absence is surrender, given that for now and for at least the next 6 months, if not 18 months, Washington is going to have an outsized influence in terms of what the market looks like, who the winners, who the losers are going to be, and also who's going to get help.
Yeah.
Who's going to be left behind.
Yeah, certainly. For everyone who's here, if you have questions that you'd like to toss in, we're going to go for another 5 or 6 minutes, and I want to make sure that I cover anything. If you do have any questions, just add them to the Q&A. In the meantime, you have what is your most tinfoil hat concern right now? We were talking about potentially around voting. We're coming into a major election in November. There may be a second spike. What can or should we expect, and what are you concerned about?
So one of my true passions and concerns is the integrity of our election system. And we know from 2016 that our system was hacked, that Russians not only were able to use our social networks in unforeseen ways to suppress vote, but we also know that folks got into the data files down at the state and local levels. My big concern is in this pandemic world where people are less engaged politically, that the attention that needs to be paid to having a system that works isn't happening. So our democracy is really fragile, and we put it through really dumb technology. So I have the expectation that when I cast my vote, that it will be counted in the way that I intended to be counted. Given that we know that the system has been compromised and we've had another 4 years for people to get better at breaking into it, I'm really concerned. This is an issue that has not had enough money and attention paid to it. And so that was going on before COVID-19, and now we have a situation where people are really scared to go and vote. And we saw an outbreak with the Wisconsin primary, and in November, we don't know where we're going to be. And so I'm really passionate about efforts to vote by mail, but there are very real limitations. And I think, we all need to participate, but we all need to also be able to rely on the sanctity of our system to produce the candidate that the American people want.
So two last questions. One, do you have a perspective on a pandemic creates a certain set of circumstances, and especially the need for social distancing creates a set of circumstances that could be used as an excuse for mass surveillance. And I'm curious how you see that playing out over the next 4 or 5 years. Do you think that there are things, and mass surveillance may be one of them, maybe there's something else. Do you think that there are things that in the near term, we expect people to use the pandemic as an excuse to deploy or to use or to otherwise infringe in privacy?
So that's a question worthy of an hour.
Yeah.
Privacy is an issue that Congress has been struggling with over the last couple of years in this environment where there is a need for testing and contact tracing and communication as to what is going on. In order, we're going to have to find this balance between privacy of individuals, the need for information in order to resume the economy. And this will be something that folks in Washington are going to spend a lot of time struggling with to answer. But I think, if we're in a situation where COVID-19 is with us for, 2.5 years, people may be in a position where they are going to have to share more information than they're comfortable sharing. But we're going to be limited in terms of people's acceptance until people understand the value and
Right.
are willing to voluntarily share that information. I don't see the U.S. giving into a top-down surveillance approach. But if people individually see the benefit and get excited by participating, because as an American, you want to inform others if you're sick, or you want to know if others around you are sick.
Yeah.
So it's really got to come from people, but it's something that has to be watched really closely. And the employers have the same sort of issue, which is, all right, bring people back in. What can you do with your employees? What can you do with your customers? Can you take their temperature? Can you give them COVID exams? FDA is looking at these issues right now.
Who is
And
the
what do
authority
they
on
do
this?
with the information? How long do they hold on to the information? Who do they share the information with?
Who gets to decide that? Is that FDA? Like, who is it is there a regulatory body, the Consumer Protection Agency? Who's the body that decides?
It will be an interagency process, and it's not clear which direction the federal government is going to go.
Gotcha. So,
But at this point, it looks like it's going to be FDA.
and so you think it's likely an opt-in system? We just have another minute or two, and then we're gonna wrap. But you think that it's mostly going to be like we either culturally opt in, or it doesn't happen. So sort of like voluntary military as opposed to a draft.
Right.
Gotcha. I guess that makes me feel a
And
little bit better.
that may change if we, have to shut down completely again in the fall and people want brighter lines and stricter rules of the road. The one thing about Washington is things don't happen absent a crisis. And so that's when you see big changes in behavior and big changes in terms of acceptance of practices. So at this point, yes, it's opt-in, but if we're all back home and it's like, all right, how do we get the healthy people working? There's going to be more appetite.
Yeah. Last question. What is the reality that no one is talking about? Is it the complexity of voting? What is something that you feel people aren't talking about, but is something that we're very much going to have to face?
It's the consequences of the federal spending right now will impact everybody on this phone call. And we tripled the size of the deficit this year. And this is not free money. And at some point, we're going to have to, as a country, pay back our bills. And when you see proposals like, let's do away with the payroll tax for 2 years, sounds awesome as an employer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been an idea pushed forward by the president. The reality is those payroll taxes fund Medicare, they fund Social Security. And so, we're starting to get into a situation where Social Security's solvency may be in question in the next 10 to 15 years. And so that affects all of us. It feels a long ways off, but no matter who is in the White House in January, we can expect tax increases across the board.
I think
that's not really a happy note.
Not to leave on an unhappy note. Do you have a happy note that you'd like to leave on? We're happy to. That's like a beautiful painting that you have behind you.
I'm just filled with gratitude for the people in my life, and that in this moment, being able to see and treasure the really small things is a huge gift. And all of us have been flying so hard, so fast that maybe we haven't seen it. And so that gives me a lot of joy.
It also seems, regardless of politics, it seems like those who are in public service are working really hard to try to help in any way they can.
Yeah, and they are there to help. I will say that no matter who the member is or their party affiliation, they come to Washington in all earnestness to make the world a better place, in their vision of what a better place might be. But folks are trying to get this right, and the only way they can get it right is hearing from individuals. And everybody has a member of Congress and 2 senators that will answer their calls. And so if you have an issue, now's the time to ask for help, and they should help.
That is a great place to end. Heather, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. And any parting thoughts on where people should go if they have additional questions about government policy? dealing with DC.
Absolutely. I am always happy to be a resource. The name of the firm is Invariant, and you can find me at Podesta at invariantgr.com.
Cool. Thank you so much, Heather. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
See you.